So thanks for having me today. Unfortunately, I'm going to have to run right at 11, so I won't be able to stick around after for questions, but Camilia will be able to stay, so you can chat with her after. But if there's anything that I go over and you have a burning question, feel free to interrupt me and we can chat about it then. Okay. So just to introduce my lab a little bit, we're based out of the University of Calgary, but we're actually located physically at the Children's Hospital. And Camilia is my wonderful research assistant who coordinates our biggest study and oversees a lot of things in the lab. And then I work with a group of students and postdoctoral fellows and other trainees who do a lot of the work that I'll be talking about today. But really the lab is focused on typical and atypical brain development in kids, with goals of understanding how brain structure and function relate to things like kids' behavior, kids' cognition, and also the environment around them. So a couple of things we're interested in are language and motor development in the kids. And we also look at the impact of maternal health and maternal factors on children's brain development. So right now this is focused on primarily alcohol exposure and maternal mental health and how those affect the kids' development. So I'm going to talk about some of the studies that I am involved in and leading in these areas. But first, I'll give you a little bit of an overview of brain imaging, what we can do, why we might want to do it, and how it's useful. So brain imaging, and when I say brain imaging, I'm talking mostly about magnetic resonance imaging, although there are other types. Our lab just uses MRI. We can measure brain structure, brain function, and brain metabolism in many different ways and really get a wealth of incredible information about the brain, non-invasively without harming the volunteer at all. So a few of the things we can look at are related to structure, and that's mostly what I'm going to focus on today. So we can look at cortical gray matter, which is this ribbon of gray matter around the outer surface of the brain that I've highlighted in green there. And some people kind of associate this with the brain's computer. So it's the part of the brain that does a lot of the work, the processing work. And we can look at things here like volume, thickness of the cortex, how it's functioning with metabolism, also how its function is related to other parts of the brain. Then we've got deep gray matter, which are these larger structures mostly in the middle of the brain. And these would be commonly thought of as the relay station, sort of the in-between point between the cortex and the rest of the body. So they're integrating motor and sensory information and helping send it out to the body and integrate it before it comes into the brain. And here we can measure, again, things like volume. We can look at metabolism. We can look at brain function. We can also look at the white matter, which is the brain's wiring. This is what connects all of the other areas of the brain together. And when we talk about white matter, we're usually measuring things like its volume and also its connectivity, how connected the brain regions are. We can map out those connections. I hope you can see the images. It's a little bright from the outside, but all the way. Yeah, all the way might be better. We can map them out and start to get information about specific white matter structures there. So these are MRI images from 5 different 9-year-old males. So anyone know which one's dyslexic? Unfortunately, brain imaging is not diagnostic. You cannot do a simple test and get information about developmental disorders in kids. The brains all look different, but there's no discriminating feature that tells us that one child has a certain disorder and one doesn't. So it's not diagnostic, but it's still incredibly useful, and it can tell us a lot about what the underlying causes of some of the behavioral and cognitive issues we might be seeing are. So neuroimaging can, for example, highlight regions of brain abnormalities and key periods in time when interventions might be most effective. And if we know where in the brain we want to look and we know what time might be best to intervene, we can hopefully develop, optimize, and evaluate interventions so that they might be most efficient and most effective. So I'm really interested in not just brain abnormalities, but how the brain changes over time. And we know that it can be different in some children with disorders. So I'll give you just a quick overview of the type of brain development that's typical, which we need as a baseline to study atypical development. Brain development is a very complex process. It continues well beyond infancy, and often we think of it as a series of progressive and regressive changes. So early on, the brain is growing. We're getting synaptic proliferation, dendritic growth. All these brain cells are really growing and developing. We get myelination, so that's the white matter is getting strengthened. The connections are getting more efficient. And then at some point, the brain starts to prune back some of the unused connections. So initially, it's all about growing, growing, growing. And then at some point, it's more about becoming efficient. And both of these are really critical to getting a proper level of brain function. So it's this really balance between the plasticity, which we talk about as learning phase, and then efficiency, which is getting very good at doing something quickly. So gray matter volume and cortical thickness tend to go up in young kids and then down during late childhood, adolescence, and throughout adulthood. The peaks are going to vary a little bit depending on whether it's female or male, also depending on which brain region you look at. This is just a map where I've shown that cortical thickness is different in some areas than others. So if we think back to sort of a computer analogy, you could think that really early on you've got computing power, but probably not a lot. Whereas at the peak here, you've got more power, you can do a lot of things, but you're maybe not quite as fast as a more powerful computer. So this can do most of the stuff that this can, but not in the same efficient way. So early on, kids have capabilities, obviously they have capabilities. But as the gray matter expands and grows, it's about learning to do more things. So my analogy is that
the peak is when the gray matter is the highest.
In some ways, you could think of that as the brain is capable of doing the most, but it's not efficient, so it's not fast.
So as it goes down, it's optimized.
That's right. Yeah. So think of like people are sort of more familiar, right? It's easy to learn languages when they're young. Your brain is more plastic. You can absorb that. Or people who've had brain injuries very young sometimes show very few effects later on because their brain can really adapt. So right here around the peak are some of the times when you're most adaptable.
That's really like the kids. Then after the teens were like,
but they're faster.
They're a little faster.
They're faster, I think.
I get it now.
Yep. So, I mean, it's a simplification, but it's kind of what we're getting at. This balance between plasticity and adaptability, flexibility, and being really good at things and really fast and being able to access that information.
What's the difference between red and blue?
Those are just girls and boys. So girls, this is some data from the whole brain, so it's a bit simplified. There's a lot of regional variation, but girls peak earlier than boys in terms of cortical thickness. They peak at different times for different processes and different brain regions, but in general, girls peak earlier, but also boys have bigger brains.
Clearly.
You can think of it as, maybe the women are a little more, are using their brain a little better because they don't have as much, but they don't show any differences in cognition. So that's gray matter, which goes up and down. And we've got this sort of inverted U-shaped curve. Whereas white matter tends to go more just up. Okay, so the myelination is making it more efficient and those connections are strengthening. And this tends to be a continuous process across childhood and adolescence. This I've shown some regional variation. So we're looking just at different parts of the white matter, and you can see that they peak at different times. So for example, peak and plateau, sort of around 20. Some of them keep going into the 30s. No problem. Oh, there's fine. Okay. Anyway, so there's a lot of regional variation in the brain as well. And if we take this back to a little bit of a computer analogy again, you might think that the wiring of the brain, that's the white matter, is a little bit disorganized early on. Okay, so a little bit jumbled, not super well organized, not super well insulated, and not as efficient as maybe an organization that you might see in an older child or a young adult. So that's some background, and now I'll get into some of the research that we're doing now related to perinatal influences on childhood development. The perinatal health, I think everybody knows, is super important. We're talking, when I say perinatal, I'm talking about pregnancy, birth, and okay. And a lot of factors can influence perinatal health. We've got environments, so these could be things like environmental toxins, exposures to things in the environment, secondhand smoke, for example, those types of things that we can't always control ourselves. Then you've got maternal nutrition, and I would include in this things like alcohol and drugs. Maternal activity level. We've got infant food and drink, and primarily this would be formula versus breastfeeding when we're talking about the early days. And then you've got parental mental health. And we've focused mostly on mothers right now, just because that's a little closer. But hopefully eventually we will start to look at social support and other people's mental health who might be close to the kids. And all of these things, sorry,
yeah. On that note, maybe are you, or how are you connected to all our babies in terms of that piece seems like a couple crossover pieces there?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So there are two really similar cohort studies. In Calgary, there's All Our Babies and there's Apron. And they've now combined to form the ABCD. Anyway, so these are irrelevant. But my research right now is on the Apron cohort, which is almost identical to All Our Babies in terms of stuff they acquired. Yeah. Eventually they're merging, and we hope to collect some imaging data on All Our Babies kids. Yeah, but we're talking about the same types of things. And so these can have, any of these perinatal health issues can have long-term effects on the kids. They don't just affect the fetus and the infant. They affect kids for their whole lives. They affect their cognition, behavior, and their mental health. Perinatal depression is a serious concern, both pre and postnatal. We tend to put a lot of emphasis on postpartum depression, but in fact, a lot of women have prenatal depression as well. Up to about 20% of women will have depression at some point in their pregnancy or postpartum. And pre and postnatal depression are associated with a lot of problems in the children. Behavioral problems, cognitive delays, increased risk of mental health problems later on. And prenatal depression is a risk factor for postpartum depression. So women that have problems early on are more likely to have continued mental health issues after as well. There have been just a couple of studies looking at prenatal mental health and brain structure in kids. One showed abnormalities in really young infants right after they were born, and another showed abnormalities in slightly older kids. We were interested in this time right in between, sort of early childhood, preschool age type of range, which is really when a lot of the behavioral and cognitive problems are first noticed. You can't really tell in infants if there are small issues, but once kids are starting preschool and that sort of thing is when we really see some of the problems. So we had 52 kids with good brain imaging data. We're talking about brain structure here. And their mothers completed a depression screen in each trimester of pregnancy and at 3 months postpartum. And then we looked at correlations between the depressive symptoms in the moms and both cortical thickness, so gray matter, and white matter structure in the kids, and the kids were 2 to 5 years old. It's important to keep in mind these moms were not referred for depression. These are a normal sample, a community sample of moms. So some of them would have been depressed and some of them weren't. Most of them weren't. Most of them were in a normal sort of subclinical threshold range of depressive symptoms. So what we saw, first we looked at the gray matter, and we saw a couple of regions where gray matter thickness in the children, these are shown in red and blue here, related to their mother's depressive symptoms. And then we also looked at the underlying white matter, so any of the white matter connections that connect to these cortical regions, and that's what you see down here is the pink is from the red region, the blue connects to the blue region, and this yellow connects the two of those. And so we saw relationships, and what we saw was in these...
This is all the moms.
Nope, kids' brains. Yeah, we didn't look at mums' brains. We only looked at mums' depression scores. So this is where the kids' brain structure looked different in kids whose mothers were more depressed than kids whose mothers were less depressed.
And what age is this?
The kids are 2 to 5 years old.
2 to 5 of this.
Yeah.
This is a composite of all of them.
So this is, yeah, it's a little bit, if you're not used to looking at brain images, it's a little bit odd. So this is a representative brain image. And what I've shown on it is the region where across the whole group we saw a relationship. So these areas match up with these scatter plots here. And in this scatter plot, each dot is one of the kids with their cortical thickness on this axis and the mom's depression score on this axis. So here, these kids' mums were more depressed. These kids' mums were less depressed. The kids whose mums were less depressed had thicker cortex, more gray matter, than the kids whose mums were more depressed. So the gist of it is that we see a relationship. That's sort of the important message, meaning that we can't prove causation, but it suggests that the prenatal depression is influencing how the kids' brains are growing. Okay? This is, right now, this relationship we saw was with second trimester depression. It's an interesting quirk, and we don't really know why, but we didn't see relationships in the first or the third trimester. So it seems like that's potentially a sensitive period for some reason.
Is the sample size big enough to be that?
So we had 52 kids, but that's a really good question because not all of their moms filled out the screen in the first trimester. So I would say our sample size is not big enough to conclude that first trimester depression doesn't influence brain structure. But our sample size is big enough to say that the second trimester effect is more important than the third trimester effect.
Are the red and blue girls and boys?
Yeah. So 2 things. The red and blue here are just different regions. Okay, just to separate them. Red and blue here are girls and boys. Yeah.
But they don't map to the.
No, unfortunately, I'm not that fancy.
If I look at the 8,
Yes.
the top portion, like 0.2.
Yeah.
Right? Doesn't that kind of look like half and half? Like it doesn't show like at the bottom of it where that's depression, right?
Mm-hmm.
You can see like definitely more points below the line. But when you go up, when they're not as depressed, does it not seem kind of balanced? It's not out.
So this is the correlation. So we didn't separate them into groups. This is the depression scale, which goes from 0, which is no symptoms at all of depression, to 20, which is extremely severe. Somewhere between 10 and 15, it depends on who you talk to, is the cutoff for depression. So as you go further this way, the moms were getting more depressed. As you go further this way, the kids are getting thicker cortex, more gray matter.
Yeah.
And so we don't have different groups, and this is just a best fit line. So this line does cut straight through the middle. But what we show is that in this particular brain region, kids whose moms were less depressed look different than kids whose moms were more depressed. And there was a little bit of a sex effect. That's been shown here. There are different relationships in boys and girls, which isn't really surprising. There's a lot of sex differences in mental health problems. Yeah.
I'm just wondering if you see these kind of structural changes permanent or because it's gray matter, can it? Like I have no understanding that can grow throughout life and particularly in that window.
That's an excellent question and one that we're going to try to answer with more data when the kids are older. Yeah, but we don't know.
And questions of scientific research generally, because I have absolutely no idea how it works. What's the connection between this specific research and question that you're answering and other brain research that's going on globally? Like, is there a process to map onto or connect with what else is going on in brain research globally?
Yeah, so I mean this is all about us publishing our work, going to conferences and sharing it so that we do try, and with this study, what we were trying to do was build on a previous study in 6 to 9-year-olds. So they showed a unique second trimester effect too, which is really interesting. But they showed in older kids that there's this relationship, and we said, hey, what about younger kids? We can do this. And so we did. And so it's all about building on everybody else's. And that's why we publish this in our science journal so that other researchers read it and can say, oh, well, I wonder if it lasts until they're 13, and maybe we should look at that, or those kinds of.
So when mothers were responding to depression, they were doing it retrospectively?
No, they were doing it at the time.
At the time?
Yeah, these moms were recruited in pregnancy.
Oh, okay.
So they filled out that questionnaire when they were 6 months pregnant or whatever.
And then the brains were measured in children
5 years later.
5 years later. Oh.
Yeah.
So
between 2 and 5, yeah, it depended on the kid. But that's the beauty of the study. Is they did it, the moms did it at the time. This wasn't a retrospective report. Yeah. So it should be accurate data, right? It's how the moms were doing.
Did you see what the experience was of the child from 0 to 5 or 0 to whatever?
So we do have data. We don't have brain data, but we have other data on sleep, feeding, temperament, those kinds of things we haven't looked at yet. But those are things that we can determine. We tried to look at behavior in these kids, so whether the kids whose moms were more depressed had more behavioral problems, and they do, but we haven't sort of cleaned that data yet. It's not really, we're not ready to make conclusions from it, but it seems like the same kids whose moms were more depressed and whose brain structure is different also have these behavior issues, and those three are all very likely related, right? Brain, mom's depression, and behavior issues in kids. So this was prenatal. Hopefully this gives you a little of an idea, because we're looking at the same thing now, but postpartum depression. Okay, and for me, it's a little easier for me to connect prenatal depression with the child in utero to brain structure differences. It's a little more difficult for me to conceptualize what's happening postpartum, but I think it's really interesting that postpartum depression in the moms also impacts kids' brain structure. So prenatally, you can have changes in hormone because of the depression. You can have different eating patterns, right, in the moms. Like, it's pretty easy to kind of think how the kid might be affected. Postpartum, you've got indirect effects through breastfeeding, really, but this might be more of a caregiving thing too, where moms who are more depressed have different caregiving patterns than moms who are less depressed. Anyway, we see very similar pattern, where in the frontal lobe here in green, we see a relationship between postpartum depression and kids' brain structure. And what we see is the kids whose moms were less depressed have more gray matter than the kids whose moms were more depressed.
You can measure cortisol levels.
And we have, yeah. And that's on the agenda. There are so many cool questions, and there's so much data. So we try to, attack it little by little. But yes, that will come eventually, I hope. So I want to bring this back a little bit to brain development to try to interpret it a little bit. Okay. So what we're seeing is more gray matter in the kids whose moms were less depressed. And we know that there's this pattern later on of gray matter going down. So it seems like the kids whose moms are more depressed, these are the kids who have less gray matter, almost have a more mature pattern of brain structure. Okay. Same with when we look at the white matter. We see higher FA values. This is just our measure we use in kids whose moms are more depressed. This is something we see in older kids. So we're seeing kids whose moms are more depressed, their brains look more mature, okay, which is a little bit backwards from what you might expect. You'd expect that something bad, like depression, causes the kid's brain to look bad, which would be younger, sort of, right? But in fact, we're seeing the opposite. It looks like they're maturing prematurely. It looks like things are not happening like they should, and the kids are almost being pushed into a more mature state earlier, which is bad because if you cut off plasticity, that's a problem. Okay? If you cut that window short where the brains are supposed to be growing, that's bad. Kids are less flexible and less adaptable. So basically, we saw that depressive symptoms in the second trimester and postpartum were related to altered brain structure in the kids, and it really suggests that there's some premature brain development. We haven't answered that question yet. We hope to do that, but that's what it seems to suggest to us. The most important thing here, I think, is that it's demonstrating the need for screening in the moms, prenatally and postpartum. Postpartum depression screening is very common. With all of my kids, I was given a screen, but prenatally, not so much. Yeah. We are looking at depressive symptoms, yes, not stress or anxiety. They're all related, but they're different constructs. Yeah, but right now, just depression. And this is what you guys worked on, which is awesome. So Alex and Camilia developed this, which is basically everything I've just told you, but in infographic, hopefully slightly more accessible form. Camilia, I think, has some printed versions of this if people want them. If people want an electronic version, we can send you one, because I think it makes it a bit more accessible, which is what we're trying to do with our research. And the key message here is what I said, that we know that investing in parental mental health can have long-term and lasting impact. So I'm going to try to get through this quickly before I have to run away. But our other avenue of research is prenatal alcohol exposure. And despite the fact that recommendations in North America universally say to abstain from alcohol during pregnancy, that's not the case of everywhere in the world, and that's not the case of a lot of conventional wisdom. So just a few quotes that I found. Two of these, the blue and the orange, are from organizations in the UK, Families First, an organization, and the Royal College of Obstetricians and Gynecologists. Drinking's fine. Second and third trimester, don't worry about it. It's essentially the message I get from that.
Still? Like
this is current. I pulled these off the web earlier this week. I don't know if you've heard of this book, Expecting Better, but it came out about 2 years ago. It's an economist who wrote it. But she states in the book, the evidence overwhelmingly shows that light drinking is fun. And what she defines that as is 1 to 2 drinks a week in the first trimester and up to 1 drink a day in the second and third trimester. Okay, so it's horrifying to me that people are getting this message, but they are. So anyway.
Where is that study coming from?
So
because they're kind of making it like there are studies that show. Are these alcohol companies that are doing these studies?
So there are studies that fail to find significant effects of light drinking. However, it's so hard to study. It is so hard to get accurate reports of alcohol consumption, and it's so hard to find a group of moms and kids who were otherwise the same, but one drank and one didn't, but whose kids one group doesn't have more ADHD, one group doesn't have a higher socioeconomic status.
So in reality, though, there's no, because you can correlate medicine, right? It's a drug that you take, right? Whatever kind of medicine or alcohol. But they're just not seeing that one drink adds to anything bad, right? So we can say that it's really bad, but eating Kahanoff could be just as bad, but in moderation.
Well, here's the thing. Here's the thing. We know 100% for sure that alcohol has deleterious effects on the developing brain. We know that it's a teratogen. 100% that is for sure known that alcohol damages the fetus. The question is in what dose? Okay. With other drugs, the question is, are they teratogens? Do they damage? So with alcohol, we know. So to me, it's foolish to put any cutoff other than 0 without overwhelming evidence that it's fine. And I would restate this to say that the evidence does not overwhelmingly say that 1 to 2 drinks is horrible. Okay? So if you have a drink, you shouldn't, moms shouldn't be made to feel terrible about it. But that and the recommendations are 2 different, they're 2 different worlds. You recommend abstaining, and you work as hard as you possibly can to get moms to abstain. But we don't think, and I don't think either, that 1 to 2 drinks at some point in pregnancy is going to cause major problems.
Well, and the lack of evidence does not mean a positive result.
Boom. Exactly. And since we know that alcohol is bad, we know it's bad. A lack of evidence that small amounts is bad, I don't know. To me, that's not convincing. So, anyway, I'm going to have to run really soon, but let me get through this pretty quick. We know it causes a variety of damage. I think everyone knows that. 2 to 5%, huge prevalence, way higher than autism. way less public awareness, right, of fetal alcohol spectrum disorders than there is of something like autism. Lifetime cost about $1 million per kid. That's in Alberta. Okay, it's huge. So widespread, it has widespread effects on the brain. Every part of the brain is affected by prenatal alcohol exposure. They're all damaged, and they're damaged throughout life. They're damaged in infancy, childhood, adolescence, adulthood. This is a cool study that I did earlier where we looked at brain development over time. Okay, and in black are the unexposed kids, and in blue are the alcohol exposed kids. And we see very much in line with what I was talking about with depression, this period of plasticity is absent or cut short in the kids with alcohol exposure. So their gray matter is developing over this time very differently than it is in controls. In controls, we seem to see this period of plasticity followed by this efficiency, but in the alcohol-exposed kids, we're seeing something that looks totally different and probably suggests some impact of the alcohol in terms of that plasticity window. So really what this suggests is earlier interventions are better. The earlier you can get a child, the better. Yes. So part of it is like you don't know you're pregnant, but also there are epigenetic issues related to conception. Yeah, it's not a direct effect, right? Because the alcohol isn't being exposed, or the fetus isn't being exposed to alcohol, but there are some epigenetic modifications that can happen with heavy drinking even before. We also see that the brain development is related to the IQ and facial issues that we see in kids. So essentially, the more normal your face looks, the more normal your brain development looks. Okay, which is really interesting because it kind of shows that they're linked. They're strongly linked. So these face deficits are linked in some way to the brain deficits. So widespread, we see reduced plasticity. To us, this suggests this need to study younger kids. So all of the other studies have looked at sort of age 7 and up. We want to look at younger kids. In that window, hopefully, plasticity and when the behavioral problems are really becoming apparent. So we have an ongoing study. I think Camilia has some recruitment posters too. If anybody has places they can send them out or put them up. But we're going to be recruiting preschool kids with prenatal alcohol exposure to look at how their brains are developing and how that's different than other kids. A couple of other projects, I don't have any data, but just that we're pursuing, is looking at breastfeeding, whether exclusive breastfeeding has implications for brain development in the kids. And then also we're looking at environmental contaminants, so exposure to BPA and things like that during pregnancy, whether that impacts the kid's brain development later on. So basically, anyway, perinatal health has long-term impacts on the kids, and multiple aspects of perinatal health have effects on the kids. And brain imaging can help us Brain imaging can help us understand some of these effects. And ultimately, what we really want to do, all of us, I think, is support healthy childhood development. And we're hoping that our research can provide some evidence to do that. These are my little guys. So please, I'm going to have to run, and I'm sorry that I have to run right away. I don't like to do that, but please feel free to contact me after if you have questions. Camilia is going to stick around and talk. And if you are able to help with recruitment or have any questions, or if you want us to come talk to you later or things like that, we're happy to do that. Let us know. So thank you to everybody who's helped in the research, all the volunteers, all the kids, and our funding organizations. And thanks for listening.
Thanks so much. Okay, so I'm going to try now to link what we've just learned from the Developmental Neuroimaging Lab over to Sykes Assistance on the East Coast, if I can figure out how to do that. Jim is here. Jim, can you hear us? Jim from Sykes Assistance was working very closely with Nicole Letourneau, who is the Parent and Infant Mental Health Chair to the Palix Foundation and the Alberta Children's Hospital. I got in touch with her when one of the conversations that Camilia and I had is that, frequently we do research, but it's not prescriptive. We can't
find our research and then be like, this is what it means. Beyond, more help is always needed or more research is always needed. So they piloted a program on the East Coast in New Brunswick called MomsLINK. Process that connects mothers that are self-reporting depressive symptomatology with other mothers who were also at some point experiencing those symptoms, and they just connect through a phone call through the course of the pregnancy and the postpartum period, and they found some amazing results just from that one simple intervention of talking to other mothers who had those symptoms. And I have a presentation from Jim.
Hello.
Hi, Jim. I think we've got you finally.
Oh my gosh.
I'm so sorry. You were on mute. Go figure.
You were muting me, and I tried the phone in, and I tried smoke signals. I tried everything. I was going to fly out there so I could.
Well, thank you for sticking with us through that. Can you see our screen that we're sharing right now?
I saw your screen. I had all kinds of great questions for Dr. Lebel, and
great.
And I wasn't able to. I'll email them later.
Awesome. Perfect. Can you see your MomsLINK presentation up on the screen?
I certainly can.
Wonderful.
Do you want to drive?
Yeah, I'll drive it. You tell me when you're ready to click through and we'll go.
Okay. First I would, I guess as a matter of introduction, my name is Jim Murphy, and I'm the Vice President of Healthcare Strategy for an organization called Sykes Assistance Services. And we provide a number of telehealth-based healthcare programs for provincial governments and private sector organizations, not-for-profits, things like the Quit Now by Phone service for British Columbia and Northwest Territories, a mental health line for Northwest Territories and Nunavut, and a program in Ontario and New Brunswick like the Alberta Health Links program. And that's how we got involved with Dr. Letourneau when she was at University of New Brunswick. So the next slide, and these are all things that the next slide, please. These are all things that I know that oh, I'm getting a echo. Somebody else has got a machine on.
That's me. That's that. Okay.
So these are things that you know, and we heard from the last presenter about the incidence of postpartum depression in moms in Canada, and this is a global phenomenon. I was very interested to hear the last speakers talk about depression during pregnancy and the impacts of that, and the impacts of postpartum depression on children, and the relationship between moms and their children, and moms and their family and their workplace. So this is a very significant issue in our country. The other thing is that Dr. Letourneau and her continuing research is on the impact of these issues on early childhood development and some of the same issues that your last speaker was talking about, and the impact of what happens to them at age 5, 6, 7, and 8, beyond what the psychosocial factors are that impact them when they're infants, such as the other social determinants of health. But the very fact that the mom had depression after she gave birth, and the impact of that on the early childhood development and educational factors, and the impact that it has on breastfeeding, and what that might do to the child's immune system. So all these are significant things that are happening to almost 1 in every 5 women that give birth in Canada. So the next slide. The other thing is that this isn't a transient phenomenon, so moms that get this, it tends to stay with them, and it can last over a year, and also oftentimes there's a relapse within the next 12 years. So these are also, this is a longer term phenomenon. I know I'm speaking to the choir when it comes to this. I just wanted to lay some of the groundwork and why we were so very excited to get involved with a program that we were doing at the time with Dr. Letourneau. Next slide, please. And then just the incidence of some of these cases that start out, if you look at the Edinburgh scale, where some of these women start with scores between 3, 5. They can escalate, and then you can have issues with suicide, etc., suicidal ideation and actual action and harm to the child, breakups in marriage, etc., and issues in the workplace. So these are things that if you don't intervene as early as you can, it can cause much significant problems later on. Next slide. I guess the interesting thing for us is that this all began with a research project that Dr. Letourneau and Cindy Lee Dennis from the University of Toronto, I believe, who are two of the leaders in this area, did a project where they used a peer mentoring program to try to prevent postpartum depression, and they found some success. So then in 2010, 2011, Dr. Letourneau had applied to the CIHR for a grant to see if this could be used as a treatment modality for women who had actually had a diagnosis of postpartum depression, or at least had done poorly on the scale. So this was something that was done in cooperation with the University of New Brunswick, the New Brunswick Department of Health, and our organization. And we initially started with women with children under a year, and that was changed to under 2 years. And the study was ran over a period of 1.5 or 2 years of care to see if their outcomes of the program were. Next slide, please. So the rationale for this was that both from what we have seen in the literature, but also what the health system has told us, is that they're in the thing, like our core business started in the late 90s with these telephone triage services, and a lot of it was caused by the intergenerational change in the way that families care for one another. That the same reason why people use the emergency department more than they used to for primary care had an impact on the way moms were able to care for their children and care for themselves, frankly, was they don't have the supports that they often did, and they found in the literature and they found in their own personal experiences that women that do have peer support tend to do better. So if you actually had an intervention that used a mom who had the same circumstances, that the outcomes of that were pretty strong. Next slide, please. And these are just some examples of the work that Dr. Dennis and Dr. Letourneau did in 2007, and then as early as 2004, that basically that peer support and mentoring, just the availability of a voice, someone to use careful listening, was a powerful impact on the outcomes for these women. So the idea was to do a trial where if you recruited mentors but also gave them training, that you may actually have a more powerful effect. Next slide, please. So who we are, so I mentioned very quickly, so we provide services like Alberta HealthLink. One of the things that we also provide in Ontario is that 90 of our registered nurses have been certified as breastfeeding consultants. So one of the things that we're hoping to do is to expand that service to help moms that are struggling with depression at the time or at the point where they contact us to get support with breastfeeding help. We also provide these services over a multitude of channels, and our care provider, our nurses and counselors, social workers, people like that. And very early on in her research, she identified that a good way to capture or to case find for this research was through a provincial telephone triage line, because about 50% of the calls that we get are from moms, and that's the case in every one of these services across the country. So there's a lot of these women that are calling us about issues with feeding or fussy babies or just feeling low, and our nurses are dealing with those types of calls every day, and we thought that a good way to perhaps screen and do early intervention was to capture them when they're calling our services. So that was basically the rationale for engaging with our service in partnership with the Department of Health in the province of New Brunswick. And what we've done since then is Dr. Dennis and Maternal have come to us and asked for our help to make the program available. So we've signed an agreement with the University of Calgary to commercialize the MomsLINK service, so it can be made available either just by helping people onboard the intellectual property by getting a sublicense, or we can actually provide most of the services as a kind of a turnkey solution. So the next slide, please. So the way that it works, or the way that it can work in any environment, is that in primary care with a family physician, or at discharge, so that first visit with a public health nurse, or when they call a service like Alberta HealthLink. One of the things that we did is we asked a brief, a short form of the Edinburgh scale, just to do an initial screening. And we asked the moms these questions, and then if they scored on those 3 questions, and I don't have the scale right in front of me, but they then were briefed about the study, and then offered an opportunity to complete the entire scale, and we would then handed them over at that time to the research coordinator who performed that scale, and then the consent was captured, and then they were matched with a peer mentor, and the peer mentors were recruited in the same kind of way, either through women that had participated in other programs in the past, or got recruited out of a primary care environment, or through public health, and or through a website or even newspaper advertising, and they were brought in for training, and then matched with a mom based on their geography, and then they did the peer support over the telephone for upwards to 6 or 8 months as an intervention. Any questions on kind of how the process worked there and how we envision it working here?
I think we're good, Jim.
Okay, next slide, please. So, so what these mentors were moms that have had a history of postpartum depression and that have now recovered. We did provide at their recruitment a reinitiation of the Edinburgh scale, and anyone that scored 6 or less could proceed. If they were between 7 and 12, they had a brief intervention from the coordination team, and then anything higher than that, they were referred back to care. So if they scored higher in that moderate range, then they were asked to come back in a couple of weeks, and then they retook the assessment, and then they potentially could participate. They had to be someone that was interested. These were all volunteers, so they did get an honorarium to travel or to attend the class, but they weren't paid. And so basically, what we gave them through the research team, and what we've now got the capability to do, is 2 days of intensive, fairly intensive training in the background of postpartum depression, how this intervention worked. They get an opportunity to role play with case studies, and then live role play with participants to practice. And the other part that they do get is access to a nurse with credentialing in this area on a 24/7 basis. So in case they need to debrief, or if they need to have a conversation about a case, that they always have someone that they can talk to. And then they do some they capture the intervention with the mom, and they do some case notes, and those are shared back into the core based on consent from the mom. and then they do ongoing telephonic coaching, both with someone in the program, and obviously the program is all delivered over the phone. So they're there as a voice that can listen to the mom's concerns, and then also to provide feedback to the mom on coping strategies. Next slide, please. So the interesting thing was that the average score at baseline across the moms that were recruited, and there were about 50 moms in this small trial, was 15.5, and the average at the end was reduced to 7. And every mom that completed the intervention did have a significant reduction in the assessed score. So as a light volunteer peer-based intervention, it is a pretty awesome way to help moms in the community, and it's very similar. If you're familiar with the Stanford model for chronic care, where you use peers to help people with chronic conditions, it's been pretty much well documented that interventions that involve peers in a social environment are pretty impactful, and this is just another example of the power of that type of intervention. Next slide. And basically one of the arms, so this was a blinded trial, so they randomized the groups into an intervention arm and then a usual care arm, and those that were in the intervention arm had a 9 points lower score than those in the control. And the idea that using the number of needed women to treat to have an impact was a 1.19. So pretty significant, kind of at the same level as using aspirin in MRIs or myocardial infarction. So you have a pretty significant cost-effective intervention for women, either where you want to prevent postpartum depression, as they found in the earlier study, or in this case that women have actually had an issue identified through that screening tool. So these aren't necessarily women that have a diagnosis from their primary care provider, because not all of them came in through that way, but it is a channel that they can enter the program. Next slide. And that's everything. That's the MomsLINK program, and we're working to try to help Dr. Letourneau share the news.
Awesome. Thank you, Jim, so much for joining us. If anybody in this room or who's watching this video later after we publish it has questions about how they can get involved in bringing MomsLINK to Calgary or maybe other areas, is it all right if we send them your way?
Absolutely, and we can hook you up with a conversation with Nicole as well.
All right, and I think we have a question from the group.
Yeah, it's just a question. Is there already steps to having this being implemented? I missed that. Is there already steps to having this implemented in Calgary?
Were you able to hear that, Jim?
Yeah, we've had some initial conversations with Alberta Health Services, but they're very early days because they're just in the process of developing their strategy in this area. So that's where we're at. There is a version of this in a community in Ontario, but unfortunately, that's why we got involved, because it's difficult to find governments with money to invest in this area. So we're trying to help them by using our private sector sales and marketing to go out and convince governments that they ought to be doing this.
And there's nothing to prevent like several groups working simultaneously towards achieving the program in different areas, right? It doesn't need to be like
absolutely.
one.
And there's a number of ways to get involved. One, just from an educational standpoint, because I know that Nicole is extremely enthusiastic, and obviously since she's there, would love to speak to people about this. Like I mentioned, we can help people just kind of take the materials and the processes that they've developed and help get them embedded into an organization, or we could actually just come and deliver the service. So we're you know, I was very touched and enthusiastic by the offer to get involved early on, and we're not doing this to make a whole bunch of money. We're trying to find a way to get what we think is a significantly powerful primary care-based mental health intervention that works, get it implemented in Canada.
Yeah, it is a pretty strong recommendation for the efficacy of a program when the private sector is like, this is the most cost-efficient way for us to do this. Like, let's take this on this way.
I mean, we have a mental health coaching service that we could sell for people to help them with postpartum depression, but I think that the best model here is peer mentoring.
Yeah.
Maybe supported by, if you had the resources in the community to get people primary care access to counseling, that would be great as well. But this model seems to show that the most powerful tool is a peer mentor.
Yeah. Do we have any other questions from the group? Okay. Thank you, Jim, so much for joining us today from New Brunswick. We really appreciate it. I will forward any more questions that we have onto you, and if anybody else has any questions just about linking, lining, and leveraging through the network, you can contact me, Alex, at research@2000days.ca. All right, thank you so much, everybody. We really appreciate it.
Thanks, Alex. Bye.